This is the second part of the event, and the point here is to open out the discussion a little bit, but we're going to start with a number of people who've got a specific interest in the kinds of issues that Christoph raised. So on your left we've got Rowan Ellis, who's a lecturer in human geography here at the University of Edinburgh. Then next along is Fraser Gray, who's an Edinburgh-based artist who's been quite prolific recently, and then finally Morven Cunningham, who's director of Leith Late, who are an arts organisation that have been doing all sorts of interesting stuff lately. And there's more information about those three, the three of them, in the leaflet. And then Christoph is back here for an interrogation. I'm Richard Williams. I'm a professor of visual cultures here, and I've got long-standing interest in these issues. But I'm not going to say anything more other than just try and facilitate the discussion. So I've asked them first of all to the three here, Morven, Rowan, and Fraser, to respond to what we've just heard, and then we'll have a bit more of a discussion up here, and then we'll open it out to you. I realise I cannot see anybody, so at that point you'll need to sort of shout or make yourself visible, and just to make sure that the sound recording is good. That if you do have a question, do speak as clearly as you can, and I'll hold the microphone out like that, and it should work. Okay. So as I say, we have scheduled about 35-40 minutes for this, but if we need to go on, we'll go on. But there's plenty of time to discuss things more informally afterwards. So I'm not going to say any more, but I think I'll start. Who wants to start? Should we start? Maybe just start on the left-hand side. So with Rowan. So.
Thank you, Richard, for the introduction, and thank you, Christoph, for what was a really interesting talk. And I've got tons of things I could pick up on, but I think I'll just fulfill my role as the dry academic and talk about sort of some of the things that come up for me in reference to the way that I study cities. And I think it'll be very apparent very quickly that I'm sort of interested in cities in terms of kind of political and economic processes. So some of that probably doesn't chime as well with those of you who are artists and interested in the kind of aesthetic part of Chris's talk, but I do think it actually ties in. But I'll actually start with kind of my gut reaction to some of your early slides and your sort of discussion of super gentrification, which is, oh my God, how have we arrived at this place? I mean, I've been studying gentrification for 15 years, and to see that sort of steampunk development with, I mean, I don't even know what that was, but this kind of unabashed opulence and the kind of the I suppose, gentrification sort of freed from any sort of critical self-reflection. It was quite jarring for me, and I think in some ways it chimes with what colleagues and scholars have kind of been saying, which is that gentrification is no longer a dirty word. We've kind of come to this point where there's this almost absence of critical voices in kind of the public sphere, in media, where, The Guardian regularly runs articles sort of celebrating gentrification actually isn't as bad as we thought it was. And I kind of think that some of that aesthetic is kind of the realization of that sort of 20, 30-year process of making gentrification sort of okay. So with that said, I sort of wondered, well, okay, so what enables or facilitates this? What's actually kind of, what sort of more everyday kind of cultural processes have allowed us to kind of, gentrification to become, I suppose, palatable, and things like the steampunk condo to be actually, possible in the world. And that's where I think some of your kind of critique of slow art, slow living, slow practice starts to give us starts to kind of maybe provide some clues to how something like that's possible. I mean, they're obviously a far cry from one another, but I think they tell us a bit about what's going on. And I think kind of what's at I suppose, what for me is maybe the crux of the issue is that this kind of the sort of aesthetic of, say, the urban gardening video and things is all about kind of reimagining the city not as a place for kind of working and manufacturing, but as a place of kind of pleasure and leisure and kind of pleasurable encounters. And that's actually a very, very different kind of way of thinking about the city. And it might not actually seem very different because it's kind of been the way we've been moving for the past 30 years. So for many of our young lives, we've always kind of thought of the city as a place of pleasure and leisure and kind of encounter, and but actually it's a very sort of different city than I suppose Marx and Engels would have been writing about 100 years ago for sure, and certainly the type of city that my parents grew up in. And so in some ways I kind of think that there's a risk, because the city as a place of pleasure and leisure isn't a very good basis for imagining kind of political alternatives or for forming kind of political solidarities to counter these forms of crazy super gentrification. So in a way it leaves us a little bit kind of I suppose without much political resource. I mean, saying that, the political resource that perhaps was there before was probably kind of trade union or kinship related, and there might not be forms of political solidarity that we wish to go back to, but I think there's something about the way in which the city is kind of reimagined by these sorts of artistic and aesthetic practices that really does in some ways facilitate or make possible these kind of more outlandish forms of super gentrification. And so, I'd be interested to hear what other people think and how other people kind of find, find kind of political possibility, I suppose, in things like the House Welcomers Project or whatever that thing was. Because for me, it's very hard to see that as politically enabling, and I find it kind of far more politically fragmenting. So I'll kind of leave it there, because like I said, I've not said much about the art, and I'm sure these two have tons to say, but thank you, that was absolutely fascinating.
That's great, thanks, Ron. Fraser.
Yeah, I suppose I can, it was a really amazing talk, and I think I can only really approach it from a practical artist point of view, as someone who is involved in creating artworks that are especially labelled with street art and graffiti, that tag. I don't really consider myself a graffiti artist or something like that, but everyone else seems to. So, I think there's something really interesting in the way that it's kind of graffiti and street art has been co-opted into a new visual language. You can't really watch a car advert anymore without being bludgeoned to death with some sort of spray painted mural or something like that. And I think it's something that's happened over maybe 30 years, an acceptance, a normality. It's become normalized, but also it's been put on with a sense of value. People have started to read it through value and what it can mean or what it can contribute in a capital sense. So I think just for a point, actually, there's in Paris, they've been training the anti-graffiti teams in street art to make distinctions between what is good to keep on the street, what is visually acceptable for the Paris streets, and what should be buffed. So that's the term for when you wipe it out, when you get rid of it, when you buff it. So I think that's really something interesting, because that's completely detached from the action of graffiti, and I think the way, and street art in that sense, and what we're seeing in a lot of these, the way that it's been used as this kind of, as Christoph was mentioning, as a kind of design delirium, as a kind of street art functioning as a kind of camouflage for other aspects of gentrification, or supported graffiti, or kind of legalized graffiti, in a sense, acting as a kind of a form of camouflage. It completely takes it away from what actually makes graffiti and street art quite a politically charged movement, is the kind of retaking over of ownership, or kind of working within grey areas of the law. Like, I think a lot of the places that you would find graffiti in places like Berlin and in Edinburgh as well are in these empty grey spaces, and which just so happen to be the prime spots for redevelopment. There's that kind of broken window theory thing where these are kind of really the only acceptable spots that you could probably find yourself in to make these works. It just so happens that value system has come on, and it's been reintroduced as something that's become really, really cool in that sense. I think graffiti artists and street artists have to. That's a real challenge for them now. I think we need to work with that language and bring that political edge back into it and push against it in a sense from that.
Okay. Morven.
Cool. I just want to maybe talk a little bit about Leaflet and what I do in kind of the context of this conversation that we're having, and from Christoph's talk. It's quite interesting looking at the community of Leith, which is where we operate. I'm sure everyone knows about Leith, but as an area, it's very multicultural. It's got historically kind of quite poor and deprived. It has various social problems and drug use, but it also has cheap rent. And what that has done is it's created a new community of artists who've kind of literally just moved in over the past 5 to 10 years. And I've been kind of inadvertently contributing to this process of regeneration, which the whole area is undergoing currently. Leaflet kind of came out of myself wanting to showcase my experience of Leith and the artist spaces that I knew. And then shortly after the festival, which was relatively autonomous and remains autonomous because we don't get any funding externally for it, we started this process of kind of street art projects in collaboration with various different bodies, including the Shutter Project and the Mural Project, on which I've worked with Fraser. And it's just it's very interesting for me because personally I'm just very aware of the issues that surround regeneration, gentrification. I'm aware that in terms of our public art projects that have been funded by various bodies, but I know also very well that those bodies are looking to ingratiate themselves into the community in some fashion, and that's where the origin of the money comes from. These private and I mean this includes the council as well. Don't just have a kind of an unending pot of money that they just want to kind of throw at us and go, hey, just make some art, it's great. They're looking to further themselves, to further their roles, sometimes to get, a step up in the career ladder, as Fraser and I know. But I mean, we're really keen to retain our autonomy, even while being in receipt of these kind of source of funding. And it's very important for us that the funders realise that they're not actually commissioning any artwork, i.e. they don't have a say in what's being painted, and that we have, we act as a buffer between these funders. That's not to say, however, that we're not implicit with the aspirations and objectives that these bodies are looking to achieve through giving us money. It's just something that we're aware of and wary of.
Good. Thanks, Morven. I mean, I have a couple of questions, but I think maybe, Christoph, is there anything you want to say in response to this?
Mainly just thank you for that really insightful set of comments. I think they beautifully complemented each other and said some very profound things about art and gentrification. And maybe for me, the kind of theme that I take away, one of the areas where you do connect with each other is over the tension between being part of and separate from the phenomenon of gentrification or renewal or regeneration or whatever word we want to call it. That it's not easy and maybe not even desirable or strategic to be completely cut off and separate and unwilling to participate. But at the same time, once you do begin to participate, to what extent does it erode the possibility of politics? And I don't think any of us have an easy answer to that, but being aware that that tension is there, I think is very, very important. And one of the questions I often have when it comes to street art is, what would the future of street art be if it abandoned some of its ethic of resistance? I mean, what if it embraced complicity fully? What would street art look like? Would it just be, another version of IKEA? Or would it be something so shocking and strange we've never seen it before? Or do we already have that in a way? Has street art already achieved that kind of status? That was one of the questions I had listening to particularly Fraser's comments.
Could we actually, could you just stay with this idea, really the first idea for a second, which is like where you are in relation to what you're calling gentrification. This, there's a sort of inside and outsideness to it. So, I mean, what do you do? Where are you in relation to it?
Is this the...
Yes, all of you, really,
All right.
yeah, you know.
Well, I definitely feel like there's it's more times out than not, there's a complicit. I'm being complicit. A lot of the projects I've done before as part of a collective that I'm with are sites which are in this kind of transitionary stage, and the work that we produce and that I produce almost always tends to be temporary, and it's used by us, and also we understand by the people who are allowing us to do it as a shift of focus. We're hoping that within that dynamic of the shift of focus, it's not acting as camouflage like we maybe talked about before, but it's elevating or reintroducing a site into a new context. But that's always something it's something you have to deal with. I suppose the way that I personally deal with it is always making sure, trying my best and my hardest, and I think Morven will agree with this, to make sure it's on our terms, and it feels like it's on our terms, and it feels moral as well in that sense. But that's such a wishy-washy thing to say.
That sounds like sort of radical pragmatism, really. I mean, to use a phrase that Singaporeans tend to use. Anyway, go on.
I mean, I don't know. There's a couple of things that we were talking about. You were talking about as well. When you make a piece of art, it can be read in many different ways. But I suppose, as you say, if the crux, if the intention, and if it is pure, then hopefully that will translate beyond. I mean, as I say, I'm quite wary, try and retain some kind of autonomy. Fraser and I actually. Talking, I think this project's actually going to go ahead. It's going to be quite an interesting project. This idea that you're talking about, kind of mirroring. There's a number of student housing projects, buildings, developments that are spring up in Leith at the moment, and it's going to really change the framework of Leith. It's really going to change the dynamic in the community context. And none of the kind of council bodies that I've been to really want to engage with that kind of conversation about the fact that, well, what's going to happen when we have, I don't even know how many of them. I think there's going to be at least 1,000, maybe more, 2,000. I mean, lots of student flats. People just coming into an area that's already a really densely populated area, very different, very dynamic. How's that going to change things? But there's a particular development that wants to invest some money in a mural that Fraser and I are going to be working on, and I personally want to see the finished artwork not be like, this is brilliant, because obviously that's what they're wanting us to say to the community, but actually to start questions, to create questions, to generate discussion, to generate the question of what was here before. I mean, this was a gap site for a while, but there was also it was a really vibrant part of this particular part of the community that I didn't even know about. So kind of questioning where our cities are moving, where our spaces are changing, and questioning whether that's a good thing, and questioning what we're losing as a result of that as well.
I would just like to add the tradition of murals, especially in maybe more of Northern Europe in particular, wasn't about making something beautiful. It was never really about beauty. It was always about a form of representation in many different ways. And I think the last thing we would ever do, and if you've ever seen any of the Bloomless murals, I'm sure you'll agree, they're not necessarily beautiful. The last thing we want to do is create a chocolate box picture for that. We don't want to belittle it in that sense.
Yeah. No, I mean that's an extremely good point. I mean, murals are often highly political, and there's often a lot of conflict that's.
I don't think we have a history of street art as well, really, as much as maybe in other parts of Europe, to be honest.
Yeah, I think in Edinburgh it probably is through it's through a different looking glass than it might be from other places as well, especially if you're from somewhere like Berlin or any of the Scandinavian countries, or certainly Belfast.
Yeah. Just, I mean, Rowan, do you want to add anything to this
Well, it was funny that you mentioned student housing, because as academics, we often don't have a very frank conversation about where we're positioned. You know, a lot of us study class, a lot of us study gentrification, a lot of us are kind of implicated in that process in our private lives, but we're actually having that conversation now for two reasons. One, because I work for the University of Edinburgh, which has become an increasingly aggressive property developer in Edinburgh, and we can't deny that. And two, because we teach about gentrification, and it's I mean, thankfully, really something that our students run with, and they're inspired by it, and now they all want to go do undergraduate dissertations on gentrification in Edinburgh, and we're really having this kind of awkward conversation in our department about research ethics and about how can we allow them to do this research in a way that's responsible, that doesn't just seem extractive, you know, like I've come in, I've done my research, and now I've got my good degree from a good university, and I'm going off to work in financial services in London or something, you know, which is surprising, the trajectory of many of our students. And so, so there's a kind of a conversation emerging about kind of developing more meaningful links with organizations working in communities, and kind of almost placements that are opportunities for them to do kind of more practice-based participatory research. So organizations like yours, Morgan, might actually be a great place for us to start this conversation.
Give you some
because-
interns, I'll take them.
Yeah, because I don't think I can supervise another dissertation where they say, I parachuted into Dunley Dykes and I saw the poor people and then I came back and wrote my, it's just, it's, you know, but this is a conversation I think that's taken a long time and, you know, a lot of kind of soul searching for us to start having openly, and it still hasn't kind of come home to roost, where we also talk about where we live and about the relationships we have in our neighborhoods as academics. But I think we're definitely starting to be a bit more vocal about questioning kind of the university's role in Edinburgh. I mean, look at where we are, and look at what's happening in the Quarter Mile, and look at what's happening on the other side down near Holyrood. You know, so we have to kind of start talking about that in the research that we do. So that's how it's immediately kind of on our radar, I suppose.
I mean, that's something very interesting around student housing, which may seem like a dull issue, but I know from, well, I mean, on the one hand, I'm delighted that we actually are starting to house students properly, because the quality of housing has been so shitty for decades. However, I mean, it also comes with all kinds of responsibilities and an ethics, and, you know, we know from, say, you know, Lower Manhattan and NYU's activities there, you know.
Do we have that many students, though? I mean, part of me thinks that
Yeah.
some of these property developers are actually just trying to create student housing that will then, in a few years' time,
You-
to be turned into something
Sorry, but
else.
just
It's
to clarify,
50,000 students, huge population, yeah. I mean, it's 10% of the city, so, yeah.
but just to clarify, is this the university's own student halls of residence, or is this private student residences that hope to attract the university
I think
students?
it's a mixture of both, yeah.
It's a mixture of both, but it's certainly, this is, it's a developing issue. And I'm conscious of time, you know, we want to get people out. So there's, right, a question right at the back. Can you shout, and I'll hold my microphone out.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting to note that the City of Edinburgh Council has a 25% quota for quote-unquote affordable housing, but the student housing is exempt from this quota. And I think there's a correlation with the degree to which private developers have decided they suddenly want to build a lot of luxury, in quotation marks, student flats.
Very, very interesting. Thank you for that insight. We'll remember that. Another question.
There's somebody over here.
Yeah, somebody sort of in the middle.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm actually I'm a project architect on one of the student residence projects, and so from one hand I'm on the bad side of the forest, and from the other side I'm also on the good side of the forest. As we are running this Space Could Be project on the Foot of Leaf, as some of you might know, this project is about public consultations in the spot, on the pavement level public consultation. So.
This space could be.
My question is, knowing both sides, knowing both sides of the problems, my question is anyone from the City of Edinburgh Council? And the second question is, why not?
They're not going to admit they're going to be here.
They were invited and they said they were coming. Anyone from Edinburgh City Council here? Didn't think so. Okay. No, I just thought it was
I guess
We'll buy you a drink later if you know. We love you, really. Anyway.
That's it. I guess that's answering my question.
Any responses over here? Christoph?
I find the council really supportive.
Very
So it's
good.
been filmed.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. We've got in the middle there.
Can I just Colin's saying is really interesting, because a lot of the student housing development is to do with cashing in on the fact that tourism development and student housing, these kind of like Unite or maybe less so with Unite, but some of the other student housing providers, they're completely unaffordable for students, for most regular students, you know. And the reason that they're so keen to develop them is because they double up as tourist accommodation. The combination of the squeeze on communities from hotel developments and these student housing developments means that local communities are being completely squeezed out of the area. And whilst, yeah, I appreciate some of the student housing development is a good thing, students need somewhere to live, and there are problems with HMOs and all the rest of it, but where students have been able to take on flats and sort of under an HMO, they've got more secure tenancy, therefore they're more likely to become part of that community and integrate much better, and perhaps then stay on and become permanent residents of Edinburgh. Whereas the kind of students that are staying in the student accommodation, quite often are overseas postgraduate students that can afford to do that. They're only staying for 6 months. They're not really interested in investing in the communities in the same kind of way. So how is that benefiting? Do you know what I mean? Whilst you say, oh yeah, that's great, the students have good accommodation.
No.
Which students are getting the good accommodation?
Well, it's a difficult one. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons for different authoritative bodies to want to invest. I mean, sometimes it can be as stupid as they're going to be digging up the roads for 6 months. So why don't you give those guys some money in there?
I think you could also connect this to broader trends, which are very active across Europe, as the basic identity of the university as a public institution is changing. So as the university is increasingly privatized and corporatized, we see the property development side of the institution getting more and more active, more and more powerful. And I mean, I used to work in the UK when they first introduced tuition fees, and I remember them saying, oh, you have nothing to worry about. It'll be £1,000 max. And look at where we are now. And I think, you know, what we're seeing with the private student residences that are kind of growing up as almost like parasite businesses around universities to cash in on the rich postgraduate foreign students, I think what you're also seeing is the student being seen as this kind of unit that can, you know, buy a degree, buy the temporary student housing, and then we'll move on and buy the expensive condo, and then if they work really, really hard and grow the right kind of beard, then they can live in the steampunk 14 place. But, and it connects also to things like the Airbnb issue in cities like Paris, who are really, really concerned by how much of the residential property is now not being used to live in, but is being used to rent out short-term to visitors. You know, and all these things interconnect. And I think that's the alarming pattern, is not just what's happening locally, which is real and serious, but also how this is actually part of a much larger European, perhaps even global trend.
Well, and I think, you know, that sort of gentrification no longer being a dirty word masks all of that, because people still have this imaginary of this kind of quaint people coming in and using their kind of, you know, elbow grease to update an old Victorian terrace. And when you look at, actually, we're talking about big developers, state-sponsored kind of gentrification. I mean, the university is a publicly funded institution, and so it's public money ultimately supporting this level of gentrification. And I think, you know, that's completely sort of missing from the debate. And, you know, this, maybe that's another kind of element to the definition of super gentrification, is who are the gentrifiers. They're much larger sort of entities, and very often they're state entities.
There's a few questions, so we need to get to this one. Stacey over there, I think we need to hear.
Yeah, just on your point, I'd like to direct anyone who's kind of interested in that exact aspect. We've got an article in the New Metropolitan. We had an interview with the author of The City as a Political Idea. And one of the things that came out of the discussion when we had an interview with him was, I think he's at Plymouth University, and he said, why don't we make students citizens of the city? You know, why don't we give them almost a key to the city, in the sense that they can vote on local issues, and they can even have a kind of wider vote, and they can actually be
tax them.
tax
Oh,
out.
yeah. Well, it's a really good. He has some really interesting ideas. So by all means, like look into that more. I won't go on about it, but
I would not be surprised if some of those things actually happen.
yeah.
But there's all kinds of devolutionary trends which point in that direction at
Well,
the
he
moment.
was taking the idea of the alumni further and saying rather than he was saying, you know, while students are in your city, rather than just, you know, taking their money, actually, you know, give them the kind of key to the city so that when they graduate from the city and they move on somewhere else, they've got a stake in the city. And I thought there was something really quite interesting about that. And yeah, it depends how it's played out. But so
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a look at the new Met. Question at the front.
Yeah, so you talked about a mural that you've been commissioned to make, and it's sort of trying to make homage to what was there before. Obviously, cultural appropriation is quite a contentious issue at the moment, like the American headdresses, Native American headdresses in Glastonbury have just been banned from being sold. How would you be careful not to be like, this is us, this is who's living here now, but look what was here before and look what's been built upon it, you know?
Well, I mean, we're still in the very early days, and the money's not in the bank account yet, so it might all fall through. But the thing that I think, the thing that really for me made the project viable, because if someone says to me, a student property developer wants to give you money, I instantly want to, you know, like just say thanks, see you later. Was that we met a number of older residents, actual residents in a local housing association, who talked a lot to us about their experiences of what it used to be like. And I don't know, I think I fell in love with them a bit, and I felt that I learned something, and that we could teach other people something about the area, that we could not only display that in some form on a wall, but we could also bring people together, even if it's for a very short space of time. I don't know, it's a bit sad, but...
Yeah. I also think some people want to be offended, and I think that's not something you can really factor in, really. You have to just produce. I think giving authorship as much as possible to what community is there is an important step, actually. And you could be cynical with that, but I think some of the murals that we've done in the past, through things like community consultation and weaving in certain narratives, have allowed other people to take authorship over it and ownership over it. And if you have that, then it's obviously it's partly your mural, but it's their mural as well. They can take real ownership over it, and they can be very defensive about it too. We were quite surprised on one of the ones that we did down the bottom of Leith and Halmire, how people will take it on as theirs and how they will fight for it as well.
A guy almost headbutted me, he was so happy. Seriously, it was just insane. But like also, as Fraser says, there's ways you can weave in stories and associations, but then there's also a way for you to produce your own story and narrative through that people might not be able to read so easily.
Yeah, you can be subversive.
Yeah. Okay, a few more questions. There's one at the front, though.
Just two questions. I wonder, in the panel's view, what areas of Edinburgh are moving into super gentrification, or whether many of them are still in gentrification, or whether many of them were still always just rich. Anyway. But also, if Christoph's not aware, there's discussion in the city at the moment called Desire Lines, which is sort of Park Council discussion, but also discussion with many of the large organisations such as the festivals, the galleries, individual practitioners. And there was an event at Summer Hall late last year, which was looking at what things needed to be modified or discussed to help culture get on its own terms in the city. And the second event was at the
Assembly rooms.
Assembly rooms, thank you. And that was a little bit more, I would say, corporate, because a lot of the individual practitioners weren't there. And what kind of disturbed me at the end was that one of the main points which one of the people sort of coordinating was discussing turning Leith Walk into a cultural boulevard, which I just wanted to bark at.
I hate it, the new cultural quarter.
Well, exactly.
Where's the new cultural
I was
quarter?
wondering what people's thoughts are in terms of this Desire Lines, which could be very good for the city, to be honest. Is maybe not mutating into a tool of gentrification in its own self, I'm a bit concerned about that.
There's two questions there, so thoughts?
I know a wee
You're
bit
asking
about
because you want
Desirelines,
to invest,
but
I'm not going to tell you. No, no, but I think New Waverly's certainly on people's radar as a potential kind of.
What's New
thing.
Waverly?
Or that big, well, it's got a new name now, doesn't it? Carlton Gate, thank you. Yeah,
right.
yeah, yep. So, you know.
Which is now an area where there's a lot of street art,
Yeah,
funnily enough.
funnily enough. So in terms of areas that, you know, are kind of on.
Just look for something that's got street art.
Yeah, it's.
Sorry.
I have to say, from a personal point of view, I mean, I've been here for forever, and I'm still amazed that, you know, for a city that's so rich, how little developmental activity there is, which that may not be the right thing to say in this context, but I am amazed how little there is, given the amount of corporate wealth there is. That's obviously the wrong thing to say. Let's take a couple more questions. Oh gosh, there's lots now. Let's have one at the front.
So I just have a question about the nature of slow art and urban farming, because I've just been researching this a bit, and it seems like a lot of art and urban farming is only placed on spaces that are created to be developed. They're like in some way temporary, and that seems defining to them. And I was wondering if you can kind of come with a solution to how to, I guess, redefine these spaces of like urban art and urban agriculture without making them a process of gentrification and without kind of legalizing them and creating, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose, I was just going to say, I suppose there's lots of instances where that's happened, where people have just taken it into their own hands. Like, it depends which avenues you want to take. I suppose most people will try to go through appropriate channels, and these are the ways that they filter through into that. But there's lots of projects like this that have happened where people have just gone up, cut the bolt off the fence and just gone in there and started taking it over themselves. You know, there's been situations in Dundee and things like that where that's happened. In particular,
And what happened to those spaces?
everything gets absorbed, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just does naturally. It just gets absorbed.
Yeah, but I suppose it's on your terms. In that sense.
Sorry, I find it very annoying to hear that it's natural. I don't think it is natural. I think
I don't. Natural isn't quite the right word, but.
Okay.
No.
I think it reflects the tendency of capitalism to use space for its own good. It's not a natural process, and it's a use of who has ownership or not. So this is a very raw reaction, and it's not a question, but I just don't want to hear it's natural.
That's good point. Do you want any responses?
Well, I just wanted to say something about the urban farming side of your question. What was kind of interesting about the Amsterdam farm pods is they did a lot of research, and they thought about, all right, if we want to start doing some urban farming in this neighborhood, how might we approach this spatially, architecturally? And the idea was to create a semi-mobile model. So it wasn't about trying to get space and hang on to space, but rather to very flexibly, in a very relaxed way, occupy space for a temporary amount of time, and then when it was going to be newly used, you could pick up and move somewhere else. And that's exactly what's happened in the neighborhood. They've moved somewhere else. But with urban farming, there are many, many kinds of urban farming, and I think the geography of urban farming, as well as the politics and economics of it, are very interesting. So the way urban farming works in Western Europe or the US is very different than other parts of the world. So I think in cities like Amsterdam, it's very closely tied to lifestyle, to creative professionals, to that side of that end of the cliche, and of course the same as in New York. But you also have very permanent space. It's not always about being temporary or strategic or insurgent. The Eagle Street Rooftop Garden is a permanent installation, and it's 5,000 square feet or something, and it's going to be there in the long term. If you go to a country like Cuba and go to somewhere like Havana, something like 70 to 80% of all fresh produce is grown in the city. So this is a kind of permanent, almost a structural feature of the urban ecology and urban economy. So the geography of urban farming is very interesting, and if you look at somewhere like Mumbai or Beijing, where it's a very polluted urban environment. It's starting to emerge, not really as a genuine alternative to food pollution and anxieties about food, but rather as a kind of gesture to respond to environmental pollution and so on. So I think we always have to talk about urban farmings, and it's a very kind of geography thing to do. We have to talk about urban farmings in the plural.
I would just like to say, I mean, all my life I've been around urban farming. They're called allotments. I mean, it's actually no big deal. I mean, anyway, I mean, I slightly resent it being commodified in this new way. Right, well, let's have a couple more questions. One looks like Ewan, is that right?
Yeah. 2 questions. The street art, it seems like it's the description, and we're looking at some of the phrases work, it's a response to change, a response to loss. Is it resistant at all? I suppose the work that you're maybe talking about now, will it make a difference to the outcome of what goes, or is it just responding to the change?
What do you mean? Is it resistant? Is it permanent?
No, is it going to result in resistance to gentrification, or is it just responding to gentrification? And the second question is picking up something that Roland said at the beginning of her piece, and picking up on what Christoph said about the site in Amsterdam, Halle. It was Tramworks or a tram shed, and I don't know what the maintenance site next to it was. What was its original function?
It was a city government. It was actually the city council building was there. They demolished it. It turned into a super council somewhere else in the city.
They had a purpose about functioning in the city, either governance or infrastructure. And now, what is the purpose of the city? Picking from what Roland sort of said, we're not producing things. Is the production of art then what the city is for? We're talking about the aestheticization of city spaces. Art's irrelevant to gentrification. Gentrification in Edinburgh of workers' houses has happened for a long time, with no art as a vanguard to that. The colony houses that were for tradespeople are now incredibly upmarket dwellings, and there was no art involved in that, I suppose, in the Stockbridge colonies anyway. Obviously, the later other colonies are being gentrified by means of artists as residents and having exhibitions there in the way that you described slower. So I just wondered about, first question to the artist, but the second question, can we change the function of the city away from it being aestheticized, or is it too late?
Nice small question there.
If I can remember it all correctly, I think sometimes they can function both ways. Obviously, there's certain works in particular, not of all which will be available on my website, might function more as a resistance, but there has been other ones as well through content or narrative. You can introduce the idea of resistance through the imagery, but there's also, I think in many cases, it is acting as a response. Maybe I need to up my game and get up really early or go out really late, one of the two.
Well, Morven and I were discussing this before, you know, how much actually are we calling upon artists as somehow like political figures against their own will or their intention? And so, I mean, maybe the question really is, first of all, do you see your art as resisting gentrification? Because there are kind of two things happening here. We're talking about artists as gentrifiers and as agents of gentrification. Then we're also talking about artists as people who represent gentrification in ways that might be subversive or, you know, a counter-narrative of gentrification. And those are kind of two different things, I think. And so I don't know if you guys would self-style yourself as gentrification activists, or is that just kind of, I don't know, inspirational or a theme?
I mean, for me, like Leith is a really important area. I'm not from Leith originally, but I've been living there for a long time. It's my community. It's something that I want to celebrate, and I just don't want to necessarily celebrate the young white hipster side of Leith. In fact, I actually don't want to celebrate that side of it at all, but we do get a lot of young white hipsters come along, but that's not a problem. I think the only resistance that I can offer is that I don't want to see the ingrained identity and what makes Leith great be lost through the process that is which feels to me like it's inevitable, though I do apologise to the lady if I kind of gave the impression that it was a natural process. I do feel with Leith it's inevitably going down this road of regeneration, gentrification, and that the only resistance that I can offer is, I suppose, just to try and encapsulate a real sense of identity. And Leith already has that. Do you know what I mean? We just need to celebrate what Leith already has. Leith knows what it is, but it doesn't know where it's going. So if we can anyway reflect what it is now, then maybe something will endure.
No, nicely put. We'll have. I'm slightly anxious to get a beer, I have to say. So I think you probably are as well. Can we have? Let's have one more question at the back and wrap up. So.
Sorry, I know I've already spoken, but for me, there's something about this discussion which is a bit infuriating, in the sense that we're sort of implying that gentrification is the fault of individual artists. And I think there's at least, 30 years of scholarship of gentrification, which is very eloquently argued that gentrification is not to do with the individual, it's not necessarily to do with consumption, it's to do with the economics of capitalism and how it invests in real estate, it's to do with the state, the sort of power of the way in which regeneration is only conceived as something that has to raise the value of land. And so I'm not I don't want to be like defending, I think it is hugely problematic, but I guess I don't think we should just be attacking artists who are part of a system that we're all culpable in, right? I mean, this is an art college. How easily is art commodified? There's a systemic problem in capitalism, and it's not necessarily the fault of those artists. The point at which you can start to resist gentrification or urban development that seems inevitable is surely when you acknowledge that it's a systemic thing, it's not down to individuals, and that you need to challenge the discourse of what is urban regeneration for? Why does land values have to rise? Etc. etc. So,
okay, no, that's very well put. One or two.
Yeah, in terms of, I think ultimately when you look at it, and it goes back to that gut reaction as well, when we said before about it all boils down to capital, and in the sense that what I produce wouldn't have been valued in the same sense 10 years ago as what it is now, and therefore these new questions arise because of the value that has been placed upon it. And I think that's a capital structure feeding through and going, how much value can we get out of this? What can we make this for us? I think it ultimately always boils down to capital in that sense.
And I was going to say, I think Fraser, I think Fraser and I are still learning as well, and learning on how to dealing with these authoritative bodies. I mean, when I first I got some money for the Shutter project, I didn't think to factor in a project management fee for myself, and ended up kind of working for free for 6 months to make everything look really nice. We're now getting to grips with those funders, and do want to start kind of reflecting these questions in as kind of subtle way that we can without offending the hand that giveth.
I mean, just to respond to that last question as well, I don't think anyone is saying that artists are to blame or responsible for or are agents of gentrification, but rather I think in this discussion we've tried to acknowledge the role that art plays alongside many other forms of creative expression and social practice in this larger systemic thing that is gentrification. And if only the individual actually was responsible or actually made this phenomenon happen, then I think it would be so much easier to react to it, to change it, to redirect it. But I think you're quite right to point to the larger systemic nature of gentrification and really of the life of cities more generally. And I think we also have to remember that gentrification is not a phenomenon that works all by itself. It's wrapped up in much larger developments related to cities, to globalization, to global capital, to visual culture, I mean, and to so many things. And maybe, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I just want to bring this back maybe a little bit to what I was saying earlier with the artists that I was showing you in Amsterdam. What I find very interesting is how creativity, in this really weird, nebulous way, is now being capitalized in some way. Richard gave a great talk yesterday about the creative city as war. And one of the things that I remember quite vividly was the point that he made about how when you go to somewhere like Google, to their offices, that the computer programmer, everyone who works there, kind of thinks, works, looks, acts, appears like an artist. And I've been thinking sort of since then, really all of us are, all the time, that the figure of the artist, the idea of art as creative expression in some way, is the thing that we're selling in cities very, very aggressively here in the West these days. Good or bad, I don't know.
Right. And I think, you know, to respond to what you're saying, Hamish, certainly moving away from kind of individual culpability is laudable, but I think recognizing the role that art plays in kind of the depoliticization of gentrification is what I really took was a salient kind of message from your examples, you know, this idea of kind of the disappearance of some of this, and you know, kind of recreating cohesion where cohesion has been undone by capitalism. You know, it kind of in many ways ameliorates, you know, all of these feelings that might result in, you know, complete revolution in many ways. So it's not about maybe artists, but it's about the role of art and kind of culture in the city as a depoliticizing kind of force, I think.
Okay, I mean, that's actually a very nice place to stop, I think. There's lots more I could say. I probably won't, except just to say maybe that, you know, I've been in conversations like this for over many years, and I think one thing that we often forget is that things can and do go into reverse. my life so far, you know, I could think of probably 3 situations where things went really catastrophically into reverse, and gentrification, whatever we're going to call it, is not an inevitable process at all. It's always in a process of change. So things are often more fragile than we think. Anyway, thank you very much to the panel. What wonderful discussion there, which we can continue. Christoph for coming all the way from Amsterdam, and particularly I'd like to thank Stacey Hunter, who's there. And without this, we would not. Event would not have happened at all without Stacey, and this is, I think, really a vote of confidence in the Wee Red Bar as well. So thank you to them. We'll do it again. Thank you. Let's continue to drink and talk, and see you at the next one.